My question's actually directed at you. I was wondering, you were saying earlier, I picked up on that you said that the individuals shouldn't be reliant on, in the developing countries, shouldn't be reliant on the global north, they shouldn't be reliant on their governments. But we then had the rest of the panel talking about the importance of the state, and I just wanted to ask you, because we're still seeing the IMF and the World Bank quite, as you said, sort of holding on to the whole project at the moment, would you say that the neoliberal ideals should be forgotten or try to be left to the side? Because, for example, Finland, which I'd argue is one of the most, so I'm from Finland myself, is one of the more prosperous countries in terms of equality. We have a welfare state. You rely on your government. So when you said earlier that people shouldn't need that reliance on the government, isn't the government a vital way to provide jobs, to provide this economic growth? So would you suggest then that the whole neoliberal ideal should be left aside? Do the rest of you think that that's a possibility for the SDGs? What do you think the role of IMF and World Bank should be in the future?
Yes. I think that's a very good question. Thank you very much. I think that in what has been called the Washington Consensus, which Durham was referring to before, we have to distinguish two aspects. One aspect that I would say is very healthy, and another one that is not. The one that is healthy is the one that emphasizes that markets work, and therefore we have to let markets work, and we have to avoid meddling with the economy, ideally maintain macroeconomic balances in the economy. The aspect that I don't like about the Washington Consensus is to minimize the state, because the state was never small when the today developed countries were developing. The state always had a very important role in developing the economy of their countries. And if you think about any developing country today, the state is enormously important. So when we are put, and then developing countries are put into the straitjacket of the Washington Consensus, unfortunately, they are like preventing themselves or preventing the state from fostering and stimulating a growth process that should happen. I think the state in any developed country should be big, in the sense that it should be guiding the economic growth process, and it should be guiding all social policies, social reforms, the structural reform of the economy. So I would make that distinction. Of course, we have to maintain fiscal balance, a trade balance. Those are healthy principles of economics, and they work anywhere in developing countries, in developed countries. What I don't like is that they say that you have to minimize taxes because otherwise you can scare investors. That's not true. Developing countries have to collect taxes, and have to collect more taxes than developed countries, because they have more needs. They have more needs of social programs for the poor, they have more needs of investment in infrastructure, they have more needs of investment in education, etc. So no minimization of the state. I think that's not the correct way to go.
I think I would support that. I think the bit that's always missing, I think, with that when the Washington Consensus is that regulated markets work. That an unregulated market is no fun for anybody to be.
I agree as well.
And that necessitates a very large role for the state. And the World Bank, I think the IMF maybe not so much. The World Bank has quite a lot of different faces in different thinking about different things, and is going through a certain amount of change since Jim Kim came in. So it's hard to critique it all in one place. There is certainly in the water and sanitation is largely the preserve of a slightly strange growth on the side of the World Bank, which is the water and sanitation program, and it's a little bit more. I think it came earlier to the conclusion of the role of the state than some other parts of the bank, perhaps. There is still a lot of work to be done, but they have two the World Bank has two things that force it to recognise, I think, the role of the state in some areas. One is that the states are their clients, the governments are their clients, so they have no. So as the kind of pushback against the deregulation or privatisation has gained momentum, it's been harder for them to force it through, and they need to get their money out the door. But also with particularly in the water sector, the devastating effect of unregulated markets is quite immediately apparent. In that people get sick and it's pretty obvious. So and there's no question that everybody needs to get access to clean water. So it becomes perhaps it's an easier sell than in agriculture. So there are parts of the World Bank that I think recognise that. There is another structural thing that pushes it the other way, which is that they want to lend money, and lending money inherently pushes against the need to focus on the poorest, because money that's lent needs to be repaid. There's an interesting, if I can have a little digression, there's a situation in Ghana where the assessment of the government is being assessed on how much they're doing on water and sanitation, and versus the donors. The sector is very heavily donor dependent, and but the government says, well, a certain amount of this donor money is loans, and those loans are being paid back, and that's our money. So this should be counted as government work, not as donor work, and taking that accountability back on the loan sector, and also putting that back onto their own balance sheet. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, and something that it would push. It would be a big challenge to a lot of the development world, because a huge amount of what's counted as aid is actually loans on very generous terms, but loans. And if we started to say, well, actually, that's actually, or the vast majority of that is actually the government's own money. What are you doing? What are you earning? The amount of money that is sort of freely given, as it were, becomes very, very small, and that changes, I think, the way we have to think about what aid is and what its impact is. There's a point I wanted to raise earlier that I omitted about that we do need to have a suitable amount of humility about what good and bad aid and aid structure and aid goals can have. That it's, that a lot of the other stuff we're talking about here, the tax regime, the trade regime, there is a lot of stuff that's bigger, and aid can be extremely important for a lot of poor people and change and influence their lives, but it's not the only game in town, and there's more. So the role for the World Bank, it's varied, I think, and it's about pushing them to do the best they can as an international institution. There are upsides to a global organisation. I think the governance is a challenge with both of them. I think the voting rights and the control is a bit of an anachronism, and will. I think that's an area that fundamentally needs to be looked at. But whether they sort of have a place as part of the funding for certain contexts, I think is not cut and dry.
Natalie, did you want to comment?
A couple of brief comments. Yes, agree with taxation. I've touched on it. Yes, agree that markets do need to have some form of regulation. A couple of thoughts actually on this issue of the World Bank lending and the grants and the types of grants. Now, I think when you really look at aid and the amount of that money that is loaned rather than given, it poses a valid question, which is a useful question if we really want to move away from a notion of neo-colonialism and towards a notion of self-sufficiency. And the question is, who is actually doing the work to tackle poverty? We live in a narrative that suggests it is the West, it is money from developed countries, it is structural adjustment and intervention from places like the World Bank. Now, actually, when you look at some of the figures, there are other sides to that story which actually just generally need to be publicised and heard. So, for example, diaspora, people from Africa and Asia that have moved to live in developed countries, send 3 times the amount of aid overseas. So you could say that the people that actually fight poverty are people's families. You know, people's families send money home. That's actually probably where much of the thrust for the gains that we've seen in poverty has actually come from. You also know that actually when there's any type of crisis in a household, whether it's an emergency or long rumbling development problems, you know, somebody in the family gets ill, their daughter then has to pull out of school, that mum then has to go and work long hours and leave the baby, or daughter has to get involved in kind of unsafe sexual practice to bring money in, all these everyday occurrences that are very unpleasant. It's still the family that is making a decision and taking action to bring themselves out of poverty. Their community will then help, the family then helps. The state, the World Bank and the NGOs all come later down the line. And ultimately, what we need to do is shift the narrative so we can really be clear about who the pioneers are leading the global fight against poverty. And I would say it is populations, their families and their communities, no matter where those families and communities are based in the world. And then the questions around the role of Washington Consensus and all these other things don't necessarily take as much prominence in the debate as they currently do, and I don't think that's a bad thing. And it also asks us different questions about how do we build on those gains.